Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Aaron Wilcock, and I'm the Research Manager for the Institute of Leadership and Management. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar. So today's presentation is about managing performance, achieving leaders set clear expectations, monitor performance, and give feedback. Leaders are responsible for agreeing individual performance targets with members of their team and for ensuring performance targets are achieved. It's my pleasure to introduce Andy Dent, ILM Territory Business Manager, where he leads business development team and supports over 600 organisations and training providers to build accredited leadership programmes. He also is an executive coach and has recently presented at the Chartered Institute of Personal Development conferences. Very much looking forward to hearing from Andy. And Andy, over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you very much. And good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to today's Wednesday. Give you a little bit more context about myself. My management career started in the sport and leisure sector, which led me to lead some really large teams in the health club sector for Virgin Active and David Lloyd. Following this, I moved into learning development roles within the apprenticeship sector, and more recently into business development and sales roles for ILM, where I've now got a great team of 5 business development managers covering the south of England. In all of my roles, and I'm sure for many of you that are on the webinar this afternoon, the golden thread and the constant has always been the need to manage performance and try to get the best out of people and teams. And I've come to think of this as a bit of a dark art, and I look back at with some horror at some of my earlier attempts. And thankfully, I think with a bit of experience and learning, we all take some great learning. And I hope to share with you today some of my core themes for success alongside the guidance that the Institute has produced. Okay, so just recapping, as many of you will be aware, through the Institute's research, they've produced the dimensions of leadership model. And as you can see there, the 5 different dimensions that make that up and combine to create and help individuals and organisations deliver really strong leadership capability. There's lots and lots of activity going on around the dimensions of leadership, and you may want to check out the Institute website. The link there is at the bottom of the slide for more details on the dimensions and some of the activity that's going on around them. So for today's topic, we are, or today's dimension is all focused around the achievement dimension. And activities just started on achievement today. And as you can see there, there's a number of sub-dimensions that make up this dimension of achievement. And many of them are going to be interlinked with the topic that we're talking about today of managing performance. So if you jump onto the Institute's website, you could probably access some of the webinars around achievement and the wider activities and resources that are available for you. Okay, so on to the topic in hand. And I think to open up, really, the term managing performance or performance management is really one of those topics that can stir up the emotions and the preconceptions. But for me, at its heart, it's all about getting the best out of your people to achieve an organisational goal. And with really good management of performance should come great support from the leader. So I do really view this as a two-way street. Just to open up, the Institute's research unsurprisingly indicates that achieving leaders set clear expectations, monitor performance, and give feedback. Now, as we all know, this is often easier said than done in the fast-paced environments that we all operate in nowadays. And when I was preparing for today's webinar, I wanted to come up with a few pragmatic themes that when pushed for time or in the quick and fast-moving environments that we're operating in, that we could refer back to. And I'm sure I'll reference them a number of times as we go through the webinar this afternoon. And just quickly, they are that every individual is different. Creating clarity is absolutely vital. And finally, that you as the leader have a huge role in supporting and motivating your team towards the goals and objectives that you set them. Okay, so when managing performance, the leader is really pivotal, as we all know, in agreeing targets and objectives, supporting and ensuring that the tools are in place, and then monitoring, adapting, and resetting if needed. And we're going to look at each of these areas in isolation as we move the slides through the slides today. But I guess for a bit of context, as a leader, we're responsible for setting some really hefty, large goals and objectives that may well be linked to the individual's job role, their job description, or some really global and big overarching objectives and goals. But also, we are also responsible for those day-to-day tasks that just crop up, the day-to-day nitty-gritty, smaller tasks. Hopefully, the steps we take you through today and that the Institute have prepared will help and assist you regardless of the scale of the objective that you're working on with your people. Okay, so setting objectives, it really is the cornerstone of managing your team's positive performance. And I remember a phrase that stuck with me, and it was used in my health club management days, and that was, some of you may well have come across this, but if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I suppose the first step to achieving this is ensuring that teams have got really well-defined objectives that outline the core inputs and the expected outputs from their job role. Really good objectives will have their home and be strongly linked back to the wider organisational goals so that they can anchor and really provide relevance for the team member and they can see how they contribute to the bigger picture. I'm sure many of you will have heard of a chap called Sir Dave Brailsford, who was a leading part in driving the success of Team Sky and British cycling teams in recent years. And if you listen to any of his YouTube clips or any of the things where he talks about driving elite performance, a key theme and a word and a phrase that he often uses pretty much every time I've kind of listened to him is absolute clarity. And he thinks this was one of the driving reasons for the success of the British cycling and Team Sky teams. And objective setting is a great opportunity to really focus on achieving this absolute clarity with the members of your team. Ideally with the involvement of them, so they can kind of assist and you can get wider ownership from them as well. It goes without saying that when you've got really clear objectives and measurable objectives are in place, they act as a bit of a roadmap, and it will allow you as the leader and as the individual to benchmark themselves or you to benchmark them, to celebrate success, manage underperformance if we need to, spot any rising talent that you want to nurture and move forward within the organisation. I always think without really clear objectives, we run the risk of kind of being the ship without the rudder or the good old one-armed swimmer that's just, struggling to keep the direction and going round in circles. So they're a vital part of us setting them as leaders. Okay, so the diagram here just reinforces the need to make sure that objectives flow through ultimately to the organisational objectives, but it might be that they need to link to the team objectives and maybe the departmental objectives, depending on the hierarchy of your organisations. And again, this is just going to create that sense of purpose for the day-to-day nitty-gritty tasks and how they fit and contribute to the wider output of the organisation. Okay, so I'm sure many of you, the vast majority of you on the webinar today will be aware of SMART objectives, so don't worry, I'm not going to go through it one by one. But I guess picking up on one of my themes that I mentioned in the previous slides, the key emphasis around using SMART goals and objectives goes back to that creating of absolute clarity. As many of you will experience when using SMART goals, engaging your team member in the process will help you to achieve buy-in, but also to make sure that things are achievable and you can work through what is achievable with those individuals. So creating a conversation around what you're looking to achieve and getting this distilled down to its simplest possible format, so it's absolutely clear and concise what you're looking to achieve. How are you going to measure this? There's little point in setting a goal that's out of reach. It's just going to sap the motivation of the team member and disengage them even further potentially. And lastly, ensuring that these goals are tied back to the organisation, as we looked on the previous diagram, and making sure there's really clear deadlines in place. But whilst most leaders I've seen do this really instinctively, I think when pushed for time, the art of objective setting sometimes can maybe not be delivered by the leader as well as it could be. And that's understandable with lack of time and things. But I think, the lack of doing that is probably going to take away from creating that absolute clarity. Okay, so moving on to the good old performance review. And there's lots out there, lots of opinions around performance reviews and the best ways to do them and what periods to do them over. But what we're going to do is share today some of the kind of guidelines around that, really. So ideally, a performance review would be a positive process for both parties. Organisations are going to have varying processes and different documentation to use. So some of this guidance is quite top line on how you can work within your organisations with the documentations and processes that you've got in place. I think the biggest thing with performance reviews, it's all about the prep. It's not that often that we get to shut the door behind us and give pure focus to one of our teams. So that time is absolutely golden. And taking the time to prepare and to review and reflect on the team members' performance before the actual performance review is probably the first thing on the checklist, the first thing to do. It's really worth the time investment, and it will ensure a rich and fruitful conversation, as I'm sure many of you will be aware from previous experience. For me, it's often about taking time to identify the achievements of the individual in that particular performance review period. And this might require you to run the numbers or run the stats or get some feedback or examples of that achievement. So you've got that to hand within the performance review process. We are going to touch on underperformance in the coming slides. So I'm not going to steal any thunder for that. So we'll kind of move on. But in preparation for my performance reviews with my team, one of the things that I have grown to do more and more really is create a really good list of the open coaching questions. So I've got lots of questions there. So I know that the areas that I want to explore further, I've got some questions ready for my team member as a prompt, as an aid memoir, just to open up the conversation if needed, or to take it in the direction and to expand upon team members' thoughts. So I'd encourage you to kind of look at those lists of open coaching questions. I think I'd also stress that every team member is different. This is obvious stuff. And the more that you understand about what motivates them and what their motivators are, the more you can tailor your preparation and the delivery, how you go about delivering these performance reviews. Some best practice essentials: getting the environment right, making sure that they've got the privacy and the environment so that they feel comfortable to speak openly and freely. The performance review is a two-way process, so balance of discussion is really important. I think a performance review, I've often found that team members really crave to hear from their line managers, how they're getting on and giving the feedback and hearing your views on that. But also it's your golden opportunity to truly and deeply listen to their point of view as well. So taking that opportunity to deeply listen to what they're saying and maybe not saying as well through body language and other things as well. Honest feedback is always going to be a cornerstone of performance reviews, so both positive and developmental. I think, keeping it clean, always giving examples and trying to keep those examples centered to the event or the action rather than the individual, so it's not as personal. It doesn't feel like a personal attack, particularly if you're giving any developmental feedback. You obviously want that feedback to be taken on board, so doing that in as much of a non-confrontational way is probably going to deliver the best result. Ideally, the performance review should be a no surprise zone. If there are issues or concerns, ideally make sure they've had the heads up on that beforehand, because otherwise the performance review can maybe just seem like the time where they just get beaten with a stick, potentially. So making sure that that ongoing feedback is offered, and if there are issues, it's not sprung upon them within the performance review, on every occasion. This can be a challenge. I completely acknowledge that. I mean, some organisations, my organisation, we have performance reviews or honest conversations, as we call them, every 3 months. And working with a remote team, sometimes it is a challenge to kind of give all the feedback that you may want to, but ideally, if you can avoid the sprung surprise, that's probably going to help you make sure that the perception of performance reviews are as positive as they can be. And lastly, for me, the most important thing after the performance review is if you've made commitments, you've got to keep to them. The quickest route to disengaging a member of your team is neglecting your duty, or not actioning the areas that you agreed to support them. It's just going to have a detrimental effect on the future relationship and the perception of the performance review process in future. And I picked up on a quote from Simon Sinek, the kind of modern leadership guru. There's lots of quotes out there from Simon, but leadership is not about being in charge. Leadership is about taking care of those in your charge. And I think the performance review is the perfect opportunity to do that and look at ways that you can help your individuals do more and reach their potential. Okay, so one of the hardest elements of leading people is not when it's going right, it's always when things are not going to plan. And having those difficult conversations is never easy. It's never an easy thing to do. And as you can see, there's some examples on the slide there, potential indicators of underperformance. And the point I just want to make here before we look at some more specific examples of how to manage this is, failure to actually deal with these areas of underperformance can make matters snowball and cause wider frustration amongst the team, and even have an even more detrimental effect on, wider outputs. So the key thing is to make sure as a leader that we do something about it as soon as we can and not let it fester. Okay, so just going to explore a few areas of reasons for underperformance, and I guess that the duty of the leader is really to get to the bottom of what's not making our people perform to their optimum level, and we want to fix that because we've got performance targets, KPIs, and organisational outputs to deal with. So making sure we get to the bottom of these things is really important. And these areas are often split into two different areas. So is it an ability issue or is it a motivation issue? And many of you will probably have heard the term, is it a skill or a will issue here? In either case, the leader is responsible for tackling it and getting to the bottom of it and getting the individual back to performing, hopefully. In relation to ability, it could be that there's a need for further training, additional tools. They might have a really high workload, or there might be some political or organisational blockers that you crop up from time to time that you need to try and unblock for them, if at all possible. On the motivation side, there could be many factors to contribute to underperformance, ranging from the lack of ownership, lack of monitoring from you as the leader potentially as well. You might need to have a look at yourself in that. The task may not have been communicated particularly well, or the individual has those wider worries and concerns outside of work that might have a knock-on effect, financial worries or relationship problems that might just creep in and affect their performance at work. Either way, every situation and every person will be different. So trying to understand the underlying reasons for underperformance will be critical for us and for you, for everyone as leaders, really. The old 2 ears and 1 mouth ratio, I think, is really well employed in this situation when there's some underperformance, and preparing some open probing coaching questions to try and understand the matter further, and sitting back and really listening to what your people are saying and maybe not saying, and picking up on the verbal side of things and the non-verbal side of things as well, to try and get to the root of the problem. Okay, so underperformance and misconduct. Just wanted to, bring out the differences between the two, really. So in many cases, and certainly in my experience, often with a bit of TLC, people can get out of the underperformance cycle. and can overcome that and get things back on course. Whereas I think misconduct and persistent misconduct, obviously there are isolated issues of it, but it is more linked to unacceptable behaviour in the workplace, such as the examples we've got on there: lateness, attitudes, theft, fraud, violence, that crime, that type of thing. And those areas are probably likely to move, into a disciplinary route. Whereas underperformance may not need to go to disciplinary. Obviously, misconduct may not as well, but maybe more likely. So there is a distinction between the two. Okay, so we move on to managing of underperformance. And in reality, it's tricky. It's uncomfortable for all of us. It's not the nicest of process for you as the leader, and for the team member. And I haven't come across anyone yet, that truly enjoys this part of the job. I think I would worry a bit if there was anyone that, that really enjoyed that side of things. It is part of the job. We need to get on with it, but it's a tricky time. But I think going back to the basics of really good listening and understanding, strong goal setting, as we touched on earlier, and again creating that absolute clarity in expectation is an essential starting point to really managing the underperformance of your people. In many cases, you're also kind of going to want to arrange more frequent review periods, and probably offer a higher level of ongoing support and touch points for your people to get them back on track. As you progress through this, you've got to have your radar on to make sure that you're trying to pick up on, is this a skill thing, is this a will thing? And it's going to be vital that you're there to offer support throughout the process, as it's probably going to be as difficult for the individual as it is for you. Record keeping, we all know, should be standard practice when dealing with our people. But I think when dealing with underperformance, the leader needs to really keep detailed records for the team member, ideally to agree upon. And for a couple of reasons, really. One, for absolute clarity, so the individual's got something to look back on when you're not there, because you're not going to be there 24/7. And also, if for whatever reason the performance doesn't improve and a formal disciplinary is required, then you may need that as evidence or audit trail. Okay, if the performance doesn't improve and it reaches the point that we need to move on to a formal performance improvement plan or a PIP, again, this is even more sensitive time, and the need for the leaders to be open and transparent and provide absolute clarity are heightened even further at this stage. Any feedback that you offer, make sure that it's evidence-based with a clear link back to the underperformance, so you can kind of explain the underperformance as clearly as possible and paint the picture as to why it's not acceptable. I think open dialogue, focusing on where and how the performance needs to be improved, needs to be accompanied by clear guidelines on what is acceptable and what is expected, and again, the rationale for this. I think whenever you're in this process of performance improvement, there's always a tendency to be backward focused, and maybe you could dwell too much on how you've got to this point. But I think where possible, focus on creating a very clear picture of where you need to get to. So what does performing look like in as much detail as possible, and then really work backwards, identifying all of the actions that you need that individual to do to get to that place of achieving again. Okay, so we're just moving on, really just to summarise some of the key points. And most people, in my experience, don't come to work to fail or to do a bad job. And if there is underperformance, we need to understand why, and we need to try and address that at the earliest opportunity as a leader. The checklist is a good opportunity to reflect on the key areas that we've touched on. And I guess the first point there, engage with your team, really understand them. I was lucky enough, as I mentioned earlier, to work for a Virgin company. And if Richard Branson can drop into a health club just for a chat and to keep in touch with, the problems that people are facing and how the staff are getting on and what morale is like, then I think we can all do that. Ensuring we take on board Simon Sinek's words of wisdom around caring for our staff and having a real genuine desire to help them move onwards and upwards in their career if that's what they want, or just helping them get better in their role and supporting them with their development needs is really, really important. I know budgets are tight, and we can't always give everyone all the training or support that they need, but there are things that we can do out there, and showing them that you genuinely care goes a long way, even if you can't, pay for an external course or something for them to go on. Knowing how your people, knowing how they operate, knowing what makes them tick, what motivates them. I think one of the practical ways that I go around about doing this is on your laptops, or whether you've got a Mac or PC, you can get sticky notes that you can put on your desktop. And I've gone through with my team and looked at what motivates them, what makes them tick, what their drivers are, and just referring to that before having a conversation with them, particularly a performance review, really does help you to bring things into context. Just saying it now, I know that I don't do that as much as I should, and I can't do that. No one can do that enough, but just keeping that in the front of your mind is really important, to making sure that you engage with your people. And then the final point really is to walk the walk. If you can't role model the behaviours that you expect from your team yourself, which is hard work, I know, but you will struggle to get your team to follow you if we can't do that as leaders. And finally, just to recap on my 3 themes that I kind of came up with, and that is that every individual is different, and treating them that way and knowing what drives them is really important. Creating that absolute clarity in goal setting and objective setting is absolutely vital. And finally, as we mentioned earlier, that you as the leader, you've got a huge role in supporting and motivating your team towards that goal as well. And we can't underestimate, how much we can help people in achieving their objectives and goals. And some final words from Michelangelo here, just in relation to the topic of managing performance. And I will just quickly flick over to the references, which will be shared with you all if you need or want them from today's presentation, and then open up for questions. So, Arwen, I think you're going to host some questions if we've got time.
Yes, thank you, Andy. That was brilliant, and it is one of the trickiest areas, I think, for any manager to manage staff. You spoke about how you use quick notes to support having your team's motivators to hand. Just wonder if you could give us some information about how you go about finding out what the motivators are from their perspective rather than your interpretation.
Yeah, sure. We did a bit of a team exercise, actually, and I did it with the whole team with their permission. And it was just about making sure that we knew how each other ticked, really, as a team, so that we weren't causing frustration of each other and knowing that we're all different. So we all shared, what motivates us, what drives us, just in bullet point format. Some of the guys had more than others, but typically there were around 10 bullet points that the team came up with, and we just shared that within a team meeting one day. And I just recorded it on the sticky notes just so I had it as an aid memoir, really. So it was quite a straightforward activity. And like I say, I don't reference them as much as I should, but I do make a conscious effort before every performance review to do that. And it just brings to the front of my mind, what drives each of my team. So some of them need more positive reinforcement, and they've openly kind of admitted that. Some of them, don't like to be micromanaged, so a more coaching style may work with them in performance reviews and a number of other areas. But, I think leaders out there will be able to work that out for themselves. The important thing is just making the effort to get that information from them.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And if you've got a tricky situation where you've got someone who is underperforming, and you've been sharing this with them to try and trying to coach them upwards to develop their skills, and they're still underperforming and won't accept that they're not meeting the standard, and they're even telling you things like they don't need any training or development because they're good at everything they're doing. What steps can you take to help them understand where the performance is, and to then deal with that kind of very challenging situation.
Yeah, that's probably one of the toughest ones when someone doesn't quite realise it for themselves. So I think your role as the leader is to try and make them aware, in the nicest possible way, where they're falling short. So by setting those really, really specific goals or targets or whatever it may be, and working back with them, why they haven't, or it's clear that they can see why they haven't achieved. And I guess that the beauty, that's the problem in that scenario, is getting them to realise that for themselves. But I think the more specific you are with the goals, the clearer it will be if they're meeting them or not. And I suppose there is only so far you can help people. They do have to help themselves. We live in the real world here. So I guess making every effort to care for them, make sure they've got the training that they need, and going through those steps of reviewing those points and making it very clear is probably about the limit of what you can do as a leader. And I think if you've got that genuine care to help them as well, then hopefully they'll come on that journey with you. And if they don't, then you may have to go down a capability route, and that does happen in our organisations. It's not nice to talk about, but it does, and we should be prepared for that as leaders as well.
Thank you, Andy. We've come to the end of the session. I'm sure we could talk for hours about this topic, but I want to thank you for the presentation. Really, really interesting. I'd like to thank everyone for joining the webinar today.